Deep in the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, where the mountains rise like ancient sentinels and the mist clings to the valleys like a shroud, there existed a family that time itself seemed to have abandoned. This is the story of Sarah May Pritchard, the last daughter of a bloodline so intertwined with itself that it became its own curse. A girl born into a legacy of isolation, where the only marriages allowed were those between cousins, uncles and nieces, brothers and sisters. A family that believed keeping the blood pure would keep them strong, but instead created something that would haunt these mountains for generations to come. In the summer of 1973, the coal-mining town of Blackwood Creek, nestled in the remote regions of eastern Kentucky, was home to just over 300 souls. Among them lived the Pritchard family, a clan that had occupied the same stretch of mountain land for nearly 2 centuries. The Pritchards were known throughout the county, though not for any reason that brought pride. They were whispered about in the general store, avoided at church gatherings, and their children were kept separate from others in the one-room schoolhouse that served the community. The family patriarch, Ezekiel Pritchard, was a man whose weathered face told the story of 72 hard years in these unforgiving mountains. His grandfather had settled this land in the 1800s, building a homestead in a hollow so deep and remote that even the tax collectors rarely ventured there. Over the decades, the Pritchards had developed a philosophy that would seal their fate. They believed that marrying outside the family would dilute their strength, their traditions, and their claim to the land. What began as a preference became an absolute rule, enforced with iron will and harsh consequences for anyone who dared to look beyond the family circle. By the time Sarah May was born in April of 1973, the Pritchard bloodline had folded in on itself so many times that the family tree looked more like a tangled vine than a branching oak. Her father, Jacob Pritchard, was the son of Ezekiel and his own first cousin, Martha. Her mother, Louisa, was Jacob's second cousin, making Sarah May the product of at least 5 generations of close familial unions. The genetic consequences of such concentrated bloodlines were written across the faces and bodies of nearly every Pritchard who walked the earth. Sarah May entered the world on a cold April morning, delivered by her grandmother in the same bedroom where 3 generations of Pritchard women had given birth. There was no hospital, no doctor, no one from the outside world to witness what emerged that day. The midwife grandmother, whose own features bore the unmistakable signs of generational inbreeding, held the newborn with trembling hands and whispered a prayer that had been passed down through the family for decades. It was a prayer asking for strength, for survival, for mercy from a God they believed was testing their faith through suffering. From her first breath, Sarah May was different even by Pritchard standards. Her skin had a peculiar pallor that never quite matched the ruddy complexion typical of mountain folk. Her eyes, a pale, watery blue, seemed to look past people rather than at them. But it was the smell that everyone noticed, though none dared speak of it in those early days. A faint, sickly, sweet odor that clung to the child like an invisible shroud, reminiscent of flowers left too long in stagnant water. The older women in the family recognized it immediately, having smelled it before on babies who didn't survive their first winter. But Sarah May defied expectations. She lived, she grew, and the smell grew with her. The Pritchard compound consisted of 7 ramshackle structures clustered around the original homestead, connected by muddy paths that turned to rivers during the spring rains. 19 family members lived there in various states of physical and mental decline. Ezekiel ruled with absolute authority, his word considered law not just within the family but in their isolated world, the only law that mattered. He preached that the outside world was corrupt, that strangers brought disease and moral decay, and that the only pure love was the love shared between blood relatives. To marry a Pritchard was the highest calling. To desire anyone else was betrayal. As Sarah May grew from infant to toddler, the peculiarities that marked her became impossible to ignore. She walked late, nearly 2 years old before taking her first unsteady steps. Her speech came slower still, garbled words that her family struggled to understand, but it was her physical appearance that truly set her apart. Her head seemed slightly too large for her small frame, giving her a doll-like quality that was both endearing and unsettling. Her fingers were unusually long and thin, with joints that bent at odd angles. And always, there was that smell. It permeated her clothing, her bedding, even the room where she slept. A scent like decay masked by honeysuckle, death dressed up as life. The other children in the compound, themselves products of consanguineous unions, treated Sarah May with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Her cousin Daniel, who was also her uncle due to the complicated web of family relations, was born blind in one eye with a twisted spine that kept him perpetually hunched. Her aunt's sister Rebecca, just 3 years older than Sarah May, had never spoken a word in her life, communicating only through grunts and hand gestures that only family members understood. These were the companions of Sarah May's childhood, other damaged branches on a dying family tree. By the time she was 5 years old, Sarah May had developed a habit that disturbed even her hardened relatives. She would spend hours in the small family cemetery that occupied a cleared space behind the main house, sitting among the weathered wooden crosses and rough stone markers. She seemed drawn to the graves of infants and children, of which there were dozens, each representing a life cut short by the genetic lottery of repeated inbreeding. She would place her small hands on the earth and rock back and forth, humming tuneless melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal within her. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal. As histórias que você está prestes a descobrir são tão perturbadoras e reais que você não vai conseguir parar de assistir. Her mother, Louisa, watched these cemetery visits with growing dread. Louisa herself was only 23 years old, but looked a decade older, her body worn down by 3 difficult pregnancies and the hard life of mountain poverty. Sarah May was her only surviving child. The first, a boy, had lived only 3 days, his tiny body racked with seizures that no amount of prayer could stop. The second, a girl, had made it to 6 months before succumbing to what the family called weakness, but what any medical professional would have recognized as a severe genetic disorder. Sarah May's survival felt less like a blessing and more like a prolonged trial, a test of maternal endurance. The family's isolation was not just geographical, but ideological. They had no telephone, no television, no radio that brought news from the outside world. Their only contact with town came every few months, when Ezekiel and Jacob would venture down the mountain to trade vegetables and moonshine for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Even these trips were undertaken with reluctance and suspicion. The Pritchards believed that each generation was stronger for keeping the blood concentrated, that their ancestors spoke through their veins, and that to introduce outside blood was to invite spiritual and physical contamination. As Sarah May entered her 7th year, the true extent of her condition began to manifest in ways that could no longer be dismissed as mere oddities. Her growth had stalled, leaving her the size of a 4-year-old despite adequate food. Her teeth came in crooked and overcrowded, some growing behind others in double rows that made eating a painful process. But more alarming was the deterioration of her coordination and the increasing frequency of episodes where she would collapse without warning, her body seizing in ways that terrified those around her. The winter of 1980 was particularly brutal in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Snow came early and stayed late, burying the Pritchard compound under drifts that sometimes reached the roofs of their crude buildings. It was during this season that Sarah May's condition took a darker turn. She began to experience nosebleeds that wouldn't stop for hours. the blood flowing so freely that she would soak through cloth after cloth while family members scrambled to help her. With each episode, the strange smell that had always accompanied her grew stronger, more pungent, until it seemed to fill entire rooms. The family's response to Sarah May's declining health was shaped by generations of mistrust toward outside authority. Ezekiel forbade any contact with doctors or hospitals, insisting that modern medicine was a tool of government control designed to break up strong family units. He preached that suffering was a form of spiritual refinement, that God tested those he loved most severely, and that Sarah May's afflictions were signs of her special purpose within the family. This ideology, twisted as it was, provided a framework for accepting the unacceptable, for watching a child suffer and calling it holy. But not everyone in the family shared Ezekiel's certainty. Jacob, Sarah May's father, found himself torn between obedience to his grandfather and the growing realization that his daughter was dying by degrees. He had been raised to believe that family loyalty was the highest virtue, that the Pritchard way was the only way, but watching Sarah May's daily struggles planted seeds of doubt. In the rare moments when he was alone with Louisa, away from Ezekiel's watchful eyes, he would voice concerns in hushed whispers, wondering if perhaps the old man was wrong, if perhaps they had gone too far down this path of familial intermarriage. Louisa herself had begun to research, in the limited ways available to her, what might be causing Sarah May's condition. During one of the infrequent trips to town, she had lingered at the public library while Jacob conducted business at the general store. There, among dusty medical textbooks that dated back decades, she found descriptions that matched her daughter's symptoms. Words like genetic disorder, recessive genes, and hereditary conditions swam before her eyes. The books showed pictures of children from isolated communities where cousin marriages were common, children whose features and health problems mirrored those of the Pritchard clan with horrifying accuracy. The revelation was both shocking and somehow expected. Deep down, perhaps every Pritchard knew the truth but lacked the framework to express it or the courage to confront it. They had watched generations of children born with defects, seen siblings who never learned to walk or talk, buried infants whose bodies were too malformed to survive. But acknowledging the cause would mean admitting that their way of life, the very foundation of their family identity, was built on a fatal flaw. It would mean that every marriage, every child conceived within the family circle was an act of slow destruction. Sarah May's 8th birthday came and went with little fanfare. The family had long ago stopped celebrating such occasions with any real joy, as too many birthdays had been followed too quickly by funerals. Instead, there was a quiet meal, some cornbread and beans, and a small rag doll that Rebecca had sewn for her younger cousin niece. Sarah May clutched the doll with her strange elongated fingers and smiled, a gesture that revealed her overcrowded teeth and receding gums. The smile was sweet and heartbreaking, the expression of a child who knew nothing of the genetic catastrophe she embodied. It was around this time that Sarah May began to speak of the others. At first, her family dismissed it as childish imagination, the fantasy life of a lonely girl who had few real playmates. She would describe in detail children who visited her at night, who sat with her in the cemetery, who told her stories about the mountain. But as the descriptions continued, family members began to recognize the children Sarah May described. They were infants who had died years or decades before, brothers and sisters and cousins who had never lived long enough to be properly remembered. Sarah May described their appearances, their names, details she could not possibly have known, having been born after their deaths. The phenomenon unsettled everyone except Sarah May herself, who seemed to take comfort in these nocturnal companions. Whether the experiences were actual visitations, products of a damaged mind seeking connection, or something else entirely, no one could say. But they became part of Sarah May's routine, these conversations with children whose physical forms had long since returned to the mountain soil, but whose genetic legacy lived on in every Pritchard who drew breath. By the spring of 1982, Sarah May's health had deteriorated to the point where even Ezekiel could no longer deny that something needed to be done. She was 9 years old, but looked no more than 5 or 6, weighing barely 40 pounds. Her seizures had become more frequent and more severe, sometimes occurring multiple times a day. Her skin had taken on a yellowish tinge that spoke of internal organs struggling to function. The smell that emanated from her had intensified to the point where family members would step outside for fresh air after spending time in her presence, though they loved her dearly and tried to hide their discomfort. It was Louisa who finally broke the unspoken rule. On the morning when Ezekiel and Jacob had gone down the mountain to trade, she wrapped Sarah May in blankets, carried her to the old truck that rarely left the compound, and drove the treacherous mountain roads to the county hospital in Pikeville. The journey took nearly 3 hours, the truck grinding along paths that were barely more than suggestions of roads, Sarah May drifting in and out of consciousness in her mother's arms. The scene at the hospital would become part of local medical legend. When Louisa carried her daughter through the emergency room doors, nurses and doctors stopped in their tracks. Sarah May's appearance was shocking even to healthcare professionals who had seen their share of mountain poverty and neglect. But it was the smell that truly alarmed them. That sickly, sweet odor of metabolic disorder, of a body slowly poisoning itself from within. Within minutes, Sarah May was in an examination room surrounded by medical staff trying to understand what they were seeing. The lead physician, Dr. Margaret Chen, had moved to Appalachia 5 years earlier as part of a rural health initiative. She had treated everything from black lung disease to malnutrition, but Sarah May Pritchard presented a case unlike any she had encountered. The child's physical examination revealed a catalogue of genetic abnormalities, facial dysmorphism, skeletal irregularities, organ dysfunction, and neurological impairment. But it was the blood work that told the true story. Sarah May's genetic profile showed a level of homozygosity, of genetic similarity between her parental chromosomes that Dr. Chen had only read about in medical literature concerning isolated populations. The diagnosis was complex, but the cause was clear. Sarah May was suffering from multiple recessive genetic disorders, the accumulated result of generations of consanguineous unions. Her body was essentially attacking itself, unable to properly metabolize certain proteins, her organs working at diminished capacity, her immune system compromised. The smell that had haunted her since birth was the chemical signature of this metabolic dysfunction, her body's attempt to expel toxins it could not process. Without intervention, Dr. Chen explained to Louisa with gentle but unflinching honesty, Sarah May would not live to see her 10th birthday. Louisa sat in the hospital's family consultation room, listening to Dr. Chen explain concepts like autosomal recessive disorders, coefficient of inbreeding, and genetic counseling. Terms that meant nothing to a woman who had been educated in a one-room schoolhouse before being pulled out at age 12 to help raise younger siblings. But she understood the core message. Her daughter was dying because of choices made generations ago, choices that had seemed like preservation, but were actually destruction. Every marriage between cousins, every union between close relatives had increased the likelihood of this outcome. Sarah May was not an anomaly, but an inevitability. The doctor asked questions that Louisa struggled to answer truthfully. How many generations of intermarriage? How many children born with defects? How many siblings did Sarah May have, and what happened to them? Each answer painted a clearer picture of a family trapped in a cycle of genetic decline, each generation weaker than the last, each child born with a heavier burden of accumulated mutations. Doctor Chen explained that in healthy populations, harmful recessive genes were masked by diverse genetic material from unrelated parents. But in the Pritchard family, those same genes were being reinforced, doubled, concentrated, until their effects could no longer be hidden. When Louisa returned to the compound with Sarah May, who had been stabilized but not cured, she found the family in turmoil. Word of her defiance had spread, and Ezekiel was incandescent with rage. He saw her trip to the hospital as the ultimate betrayal, an invitation for government interference, a rejection of family authority. He demanded to know what lies the doctors had told her, what poison they had tried to put in her mind. But Louisa, for perhaps the first time in her life, stood her ground. She described Sarah May's condition in the stark terms Dr. Chen had used, repeated the diagnosis, and stated the terrible truth. Their way of life was destroying them from within. The confrontation that followed split the family in ways that geographic isolation never had. Some family members sided with Louisa, acknowledging that they had seen too many sick children, too many early deaths, too much suffering to continue denying the cause. Others rallied to Ezekiel, viewing any criticism of family practices as an attack on their very identity, on everything their ancestors had built. The compound became divided not by physical barriers, but by ideology, by the question of whether to continue the path or finally step away from it. If Sarah May could speak to you right now, she would say, "My blood was poisoned before I was born, but my story might save another child." Take a moment and leave that exact phrase in the comments below if you believe her story deserves to be heard. The summer following Sarah May's hospitalization brought a series of events that would forever alter the Pritchard family. Dr. Chen, deeply troubled by what she had witnessed, contacted social services and public health officials. She understood the delicate balance between respecting cultural autonomy and protecting vulnerable individuals. But Sarah May's case crossed a line that could not be ignored. The child was suffering needlessly, and other children in the compound might be in similar conditions. What followed was a careful but determined intervention. Social workers made the difficult journey to the Pritchard compound, accompanied by health officials and, eventually, law enforcement. The family's initial response was hostile. Ezekiel stood at the property line with several adult male relatives, firearms visible, declaring that government agents had no authority on Pritchard land. It was a standoff that could have ended violently, but it was Sarah May herself who broke the impasse. Hearing the commotion, she had wandered from the house, her small frame seeming to float rather than walk, her pale blue eyes taking in the scene with that peculiar distant gaze that had always characterized her. She approached the social workers without fear, reached out a thin hand, and simply said, "Are you here to help the babies?" The question, asked in her weak, childlike voice, carried a weight that silenced the standoff. "What babies?" the social worker asked gently. Sarah May turned and pointed to the cemetery, to the dozens of small graves that marked the family's history of loss. The investigation that followed revealed a situation even more dire than officials had anticipated. Of the 19 family members living in the compound, 14 showed signs of genetic disorders ranging from mild to severe. 3 children besides Sarah May were in immediate need of medical attention. The adult family members themselves suffered from various health issues that had gone untreated for years, some debilitating, all preventable or manageable with proper care. The compound's living conditions, while not intentionally abusive, reflected a level of poverty and isolation that had allowed suffering to become normalized. The family's history, painstakingly reconstructed through interviews and what records existed, revealed a pattern stretching back over 150 years. The first Pritchard to settle in these mountains had married his first cousin, And from that union, a tradition had been born. The isolation that had begun as a practical matter, families living too far from others to easily find spouses, had transformed into a doctrine, a belief system that elevated familial purity above all else. Records showed that over those generations, the Pritchard family had produced 173 children. Of those, only 46 had survived to adulthood. The majority had perished before their 5th birthday, victims of conditions that modern medicine could have diagnosed and, in many cases, treated. The cemetery that Sarah May loved to visit was not just a burial ground, but a testament to generational tragedy, each small grave representing a life cut short by genetic mathematics that the family had never understood. Dr. Chen worked closely with officials to provide medical care while respecting the family's autonomy as much as possible. Sarah May was placed on a treatment regimen that, while unable to reverse her genetic conditions, managed her symptoms and improved her quality of life. The seizures became less frequent with medication. Dietary changes helped with the metabolic issues that cause the distinctive smell. Physical therapy gave her more mobility and strength. She would never be a healthy child by conventional standards, but she could be more comfortable, experience less pain, have more good days than bad. The most difficult conversation came when health officials explained to the family the science behind their suffering. Genetics counselors used simple language and visual aids to demonstrate how recessive genes worked, how the likelihood of genetic disorders increased dramatically with each generation of intermarriage. They showed family trees from other isolated communities around the world where similar patterns had emerged. The Habsburgs of Europe, isolated island populations, religious communities that practiced endogamy. The Pritchards were not unique in their suffering, but they were uniquely positioned to break the cycle. Not everyone accepted the information. Ezekiel died that following winter, still convinced that the family's way was righteous, that outside interference had brought shame where there should have been pride. But his death marked a turning point. Without his authoritarian presence, younger family members began to question, to consider alternatives, to wonder what life might look like beyond the hollow. Jacob, Sarah May's father, became an unexpected advocate for change. He attended genetic counseling sessions, asked questions, and slowly came to understand that loving his family meant protecting them from further harm. Sarah May Pritchard lived to see her 13th birthday, a milestone that Dr. Chen had privately believed impossible when she first examined the girl in that emergency room. Those additional years were marked by slow but meaningful improvements in her quality of life, and perhaps more importantly, by a gradual transformation in the family that had created her circumstances. By 1987, the Pritchard compound had changed in fundamental ways. Several younger family members had moved to town, found work, begun relationships with people outside the bloodline. The first non-Pritchard wedding in over a century took place when Sarah May's cousin Daniel married a woman from Pikeville, a union that would have been unthinkable under Ezekiel's rule. The children born from these new unions were healthier, stronger, free from the genetic burden that had crushed previous generations. But Sarah May herself remained fragile, her body carrying the accumulated weight of 5 generations of genetic concentration. She never grew taller than 4 feet, never gained much weight, never fully escaped the symptoms that had plagued her since birth. The smell, while managed through medication and diet, never completely disappeared. It was as if her body itself was a living record of family history, an archive written in flesh and blood that could not be erased no matter how much the family changed around her. She attended school for the first time at age 11, placed in special education classes where teachers marveled at her resilience and quiet intelligence. Despite cognitive impairments that made learning difficult, Sarah May possessed an emotional wisdom that seemed beyond her years. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what her existence represented. She was both victim and teacher, her suffering a harsh lesson that her family had finally begun to learn.